I'm going to start on a very personal note and then turn the program over to Neil. The backstory of this book actually does begin with three brothers in childhood. There we are. The story is that, sadly, later in life, 2 years ago, our mom had rapidly advancing Alzheimer's, and we found that she enjoyed hearing her three sons talk. And as we began talking, our backgrounds started to interweave. Neil, as you've already had signaled, is the scientist. And as Alan would say if he were here, he stole all the science genes when he came along. He lives in the world of humanities. He makes video games to make the world a better place and is more on the artistic side. I'm on the social science side. And what we found is that Neil's work with digital fabrication, which you're about to hear about, was compelling. We've been hearing about it all our lives, but increasingly we became persuaded that there were many things that Neil was saying that really rung true, that we decided to take the leap and assume that on some key dimensions Neil was right. It's a big thing among brothers. But at the same time, we also decided, and in a sense, that we didn't trust him to get it right in terms of managing all of the implications of the technology for society. And that's what really led us to write the book. Today, we're going to do something that goes beyond what's in the book. Neil will start, and he'll give you the 15 to 20-minute version of what is the next 50 years of digital fabrication technology looking like? What is the third digital revolution? Excuse me. In many ways, that's the setup during which I will then pick what I believe to be 4 pivotal negotiations that are on that 50-year roadmap and bring a negotiations lens to really put on the table the question, how do you negotiate with new technology? So that's the journey that we're on. And of course, we can take questions as we go, and there'll be some time for questions and discussion at the end. But let me stop here and let Neil begin with your journey into the technology.
So Joel nicely captured the writing of this book by observing that a book is a 4-letter word. It was excruciating doing this together. And a good microcosm of why this is an opportune place to talk about it is late in the galley editing, part of it wasn't hanging together. And I realized that part of what I was talking about had to do with propagating versus scaling. And part of what they were doing kind of fitted beautifully. It was a nice parallel. And they said, yes, yes, yes. And so they wrote that in. And we were correcting the final galleys. And I was horrified to see that they got it exactly wrong. That as a physicist, here, you can confirm, propagate is like a wave velocity. It's a velocity. Scaling is an exponential. It's doubling. See?
And yet in our world, when companies take something to scale, it's a fairly linear process. Whereas when new social media propagates in a biologic sense, it's happening at an exponential rate of change. So we wrote a section on how it was important for change that could propagate, not just scale. And Neil was saying, no, it's important for things to scale, not just propagate.
So 3 brothers grew up together, spent half a year writing a book. We were doing final galley correction, and we found we completely misunderstood each other about the basic use of the words in the book. And then we had to fight over who got to use the words. We decided we couldn't even settle it, and we just had to teach the controversy. So that's what it was like writing this book. I did opportunity, they did challenge. And so I'm going to give you a 15-minute-ish quick tour through what the opportunity part means. Communication degraded with distance. We now have digital communication. Computation was analog and degraded with time. At the birth of digital computing, we now have supercomputers in your pocket. Fabrication is now what's going to get digitized. Digitizing the physical world is what we describe as the third digital revolution, and it's a very, very precise historical parallel. So the digitization of communication and computation can really be traced back to this. This was the best master's thesis ever written anywhere. It's Claude Shannon's. At his amazing master's thesis at MIT, he introduced universality in digital logic, and then went on to show how you can communicate reliably even though the devices are unreliable. And digital doesn't mean ones and zeros. It's the scaling of detecting and correcting errors. And in my use of scaling, for a linear increase in the message, you have an exponential reduction in error. And that scaling is what digital really means. Von Neumann then showed you could apply that to computing. And what that gave us was the digital revolution. So Gordon Moore wrote this wonderful article, Cramming More Components onto Integrated Circuits, where he really foresaw everything that was going to come. He took 5 data points, components on an integrated circuit, in 1965. He said they're lining up on a log plot, which means they're doubling. And what if that continues for a decade? So he wrote this prescient article foreseeing a decade. On a linear plot, it looks like there would be a revolution around 1970. On a log plot, it's just a straight line. The revolution around 1970 was personal computers. But he got it wrong. It wasn't 10 years. It was 50 years. Around 2015 is when it finally began stopping to double for digital computing and communication. On a linear plot, it looked around 2000 something happened, the web, social media, all of that. But all the way back in 1965, you could see it on a straight line. This is scaling of one measure of digital fabrication, the number of Fab Labs I'll talk about. It's been doubling for a decade. So there's more data than Gordon Moore had for the scaling of digital fabrication. And so what the book is really about is, what if this goes for 50 years? Rather than waiting 50 years for spam, viruses, fake news, income inequality, what does it mean to really deal with those questions now? So data point number 1, MIT made, this is the Whirlwind, the first real-time computer. It's at a building, it filled the building right next to MIT's campus. Smiling.
We use that picture a lot.
Yeah. There was one of those on the planet. And data point number 1 for fabrication was right around then jet aircraft were emerging. There's parts too hard to make by hand. And so the servo mechanism lab took, this was the first computer that responded in real time, not in batch, and took a derivative of that, connected it to a machine to turn the cranks to make things. And so 1952 was the birth of computerized manufacturing. The descendants of that, the lab I run at MIT has one of roughly every machine to make anything. So these are the modern $1 million descendants of the 1952 NC mill. They roughly work the same way. They just have different tools at the end to add and remove material. With those, the research we do in CBA is things like among the first quantum computers, among the first synthetic organisms, birth of early work on Internet of Things, all of these questions at this boundary of how to go between digital and physical. Now, in scaling, the Whirlwind got transistorized as the TX at Lincoln Labs. That got commercialized as the PDP. Now this is about $100,000 and fills a room. And this is Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie and Bell Labs inventing Unix. The computer you're looking at right now descends very directly from what's happening in that room at that moment. Video games, email, the internet, all happened when it went from a building to a room. The analog to that is Fab Lab. So I had a problem teaching people to use these machines. And so I started a class called How to Make Almost Anything, aimed at a few research students. And every year, hundreds of students came to try to take it. And they did the most amazing thing. This is a device that saves up screams and plays it back later when it's convenient. This is a web browser for parrots who go crazy. They have the cognitive ability of a young child, and so they can surf the net. This is an alarm clock you wrestle to prove you're awake. This is a dress that defends your personal space if somebody gets too close. These would happen year after year. So it expanded. We had to keep adding labs at MIT. And then I see Nathan's here. We had to add a lab at Harvard. I don't know if there's any other classes where there's a MIT class that has a Harvard lab for all the Harvard students who want to do this. Originally done through physics through Melissa Franklin and Rob Hart with a great campus group. And I realized the students were answering a question I didn't ask, which is, what is digital fabrication good for? Ken Olsen, who founded digital, famously said, you don't need a computer at home. DEC failed when PCs came. They thought it was a toy. The students were showing the killer app of digital fabrication is personal fabrication, not mass production, but personal production, just like personal computing. And so for the National Science Foundation, for outreach, we set up sort of the PDP version. This is a $100,000 version of my lab that fits in a room, not a building. But with all of that, you can make all of that. And this is where they are. The number of Fab Labs has been doubling for over a decade. Doubling time is about a year and a half. There's over 1,000 now all over Earth. And so to keep up with them, we spun off a nonprofit Fab Foundation based in Boston, a community portal, Fab Labs.io, a Fab Academy to do not online education, but distributed education, taking students in labs locally, but connecting them globally. This was the first lab at the White House. This was a Fab City project that starting in, this is Barcelona's mayor, but Boston, other cities have signed up for cities to produce what they consume. This is a lab with the UN to use a lab network to deliver humanitarian relief. Instead of sending solutions, you send data to produce locally. These are all the kinds of programs that have grown up to keep up with this network. So from the PDP came the personal computer, not yet universal, but now $1,000 and fits on a desktop, but hard to use. This was the MIT-S Altair. It came from Albuquerque, White Sands, but they named it MIT-S because it sounded like MIT. And the equivalent to that is a Fab Lab is a $100,000 investment. The step after that is using a Fab Lab to make the Fab Lab. And so these are Fab Lab machines made with Fab Lab machines. So it's not just making a project, but rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping. These work, and they spun off lots of companies. Like a local one you might have heard of is Form Labs. There are a number of companies that spun off from this. But in a sense, this was a failure because they started companies, but it was too hard for individuals to actually make a machine. And what we realized is we were making a mistake. We were doing Fortran or BitNet. Software used to be a big program, and you couldn't do anything with it. You had to write another one. Software is now written in recomposable modules, objects. Internet beat BitNet, because BitNet grew by changing the mainframes at the center. The internet grows by what you connected at the edge. And so what we ended up having to do is kind of redo this whole workflow so that engineering, design, how you talk to a machine, and how you construct the machine is all made out of objects. So it's object-oriented hardware, so you can rapidly reconfigure it to not just make the machine, but to do rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping machines. So when you go to a Fab Lab, you don't just do a project. You can make a machine, and making the machine is as easy as using the machine. And so we're right now at that stage where if you want more Fab Labs, you go to a Fab Lab and learn how to make a machine and acquire a machine. You don't have to go to the $100,000 room filling machine. So computing finally became universal, order of magnitude the number of people on the planet around the smartphone era, when it was scaling from 1,000 to hundreds of dollars. And here we have a problem. The Fab Lab can make everything I showed you. So the things you buy, food, furniture, people have made cars, toys, consumer electronics, all of that you can make in the lab. But you need this. This is the inventory. This is the 2 tons. This is just a blow-up of one part of it for electronics. You need all the stuff to go to the machines. And so just for electronics, the vendor we buy parts from, if you wanted to make your own cell phone or radio or healthcare sensor, the vendor has an inventory of 500,000 resistors. Not an inventory, that's 500,000 SKUs, 500,000 distinct types of resistors and capacitors. But that's crazy because it's just a few properties: conducting, insulating, resistive. And so we've been digitizing the material. So here's a design tool to make integrated electronics out of micro Lego, but made out of functional material parts. So these are electronic components. And then once you figure out their construction to assemble them, you then export it to assemblers And the assembler takes a feedstock of the micro Lego and builds three-dimensional electronic volume. So now you only need 3 or so part types for the passive parts to make all the rest of electronics. On bigger length scales, we're doing that. These are, we set the world record for the lightest materials by linking carbon fiber Lego. These are robots that locomote on those structures to build them. And then you can assemble past parts and assemble them to do things like make airplanes that can change shape. And we're working with NASA to do space fabrication. All of that's based on not printing or cutting, but actually digitizing the materials themselves. So then we get to Internet of Things. The Internet passed 1 billion addresses and is heading up towards 1 trillion. And so if you take the Nest thermostat, it roughly has the capabilities of the PDP. It roughly lets you do the same thing. But now we're down to $10, and there's 1 trillion of them. And so in that scaling, if you place parts the way I'm showing, and you want the performance of a 3D printer, that'll take about a day. But if you want to make like the technology I'm holding from the integrated circuits up to this, it would take 1 million years to span 6 orders of magnitude. And so that's a problem. That's a long time to wait. But the body's solution is the body is based on an assembler called the ribosome. The proteins in the body that make you, the molecules that make you, called amino acids, work just like Lego. And the key is the assembler, the ribosome, is able to assemble itself from the parts it's assembling. So it scales, in my language, it goes from 1 to 2 to 4, up to a cell can have 1 million ribosomes, and then you can have 1 trillion cells. And so the body can place this many parts in a second. And so what that led up to is, in the same way biology does this, we're working on developing assemblers that assemble themselves from the parts they're assembling. So you have exponential manufacturing. And so here's mechanisms, here's logic, here's actuation, all made out of we're now up to about 20 parts, which is similar to biology. You're made out of 20 parts, the amino acids. But this is the standard amino acids. This is those parts, but for the rest of engineering. And so this is a flexure, this is a mechanism, this is a linear motor, and starting to build up the hierarchical complexity of technology from this very small set of building blocks. This is a design tool where you design a computation that communicates its construction. And so you have to merge the design of communication, computation, and fabrication in an integrated environment to explain how a machine can construct itself. And so this is a design tool that merges all of those properties. And for those of you familiar a bit with history of science, that should have a very strong echo, which is in the Science Center in the hall, you have one of the first computers, the Aiken computer. The prevailing computer architecture ended up being credited not to Aiken, but to von Neumann. But he didn't really like it. And it's not something he took seriously. The last thing he studied in life was self-reproducing automata. How you describe a thing that communicates its own construction. And he did it to really understand the essence of life. But he was really asking not how computation exists as abstract software, but how computation is embodied. And so he co-invented cellular automata to study those, but it was just a theoretical problem. We're at a point now where we can really make von Neumann assemblers to make exponential technology. So not only do we reduce it to 20 parts, but you don't even need machines anymore, because now the machine has merged with the material by programming the materials. And in the end, this was a fun project I did with a number of interesting people in 20th Century Fox. It's the bonus material for the movie The Martian that's asking, how do you actually build a civilization on Mars? What's the minimum building blocks to bootstrap a civilization? And historically, it's assumed you have to redo the whole Industrial Revolution. But we're really learning how to essentially create life in inorganic materials to boot all of technology from this very small set of building blocks by, in this deep sense, digitizing fabrication. So digitizing fabrication started in 1952 by programming a machine to make something. It ends with essentially the Star Trek replicator, which is what I've been describing. And the interesting thing is each of these stages exists today. In some form, I can show you all of them in the lab at MIT, but it's going to take from today to 50 years for them to all come out and mature. But in the scaling, there's a very precise alignment between the communication and the fabrication stages. And the really important thing is we're right at this point right now. We're right at the point when email, video games, the internet, all that happened. And we're also at the point where a lot of things went wrong that we spent decades taking up. And so at this point, I would get to this, stop, everybody would clap, and I would leave. And then Joel and Alan would groan. So Joel?
So as I said, that is the story of the book.
Yeah.
What I'd like you to do now, if you don't mind, is if you have a cell phone or any other technology with you, take it out and hold it in your hand. And what I'd like to do is start with the Star Trek replicator. That's the sort of true north that Neil has described. There is a famous scene in Star Trek in which the captain asks for his Earl Grey tea hot, and instead it produces this potted plant. There's some corrupt code in the software that they spend the rest of the episode trying to figure out. What I'd like you to do is to turn to your neighbor in groups of 2 or 3 and have a brief conversation about what assumptions are embedded in the technology that you're holding in your hand. So there are certain social system assumptions embedded in that little piece of technology. Just take a minute in groups of 2 or 3. If you're sitting far apart, you might find somebody near you. And just have a conversation about what assumptions are being made by the designers or producers of this technology about social systems, about use, about you, that you can identify just in a few minutes. Go for it. OK, stop where you are. The conversation, I'm sure, could continue. But very quickly, if I could just pull some examples from your discussions. What are some of the embedded assumptions about people, about you, that are deeply embedded in the technology that you're holding in your hand? Anybody? What would be an example of an embedded assumption? Yes?
That I'm available to whoever needs me.
Oh, OK. Yeah, it's assuming that you're there to be available to it. Good. What else? What else is embedded in the technology?
Many forms of information. I need many.
Okay, it's assuming that you need ready access to information of all kinds. Good. What else?
Need to stay connected.
So it assumes that it's important for you to be connected all the time. Good. What else? Yeah.
Blockchain,
Say?
blockchain, data transfer, encrypted.
Okay. So it's assuming certain issues about security
Yes.
and what have you. Absolutely. Good. What else?
More social interaction.
Okay. It's assuming that there's a certain kind of social interaction mediated by the technology that's important. We could go on. Oh, go ahead.
How it
No.
tells me where I am and how to get where I'm going.
Okay, it's assuming it's important to know where you are. I'll tell you a fun story on that. I taught for many years in the Engineering Systems Division at MIT, and one of my colleagues, Dan Hastings, was the chief scientist for the Air Force. He said in the early 1990s, there were 3 separate meetings in which proposals were made to put up satellite arrays for GPS. And in those meetings, the only use that they could think of was to guide submarines under the North Pole. They couldn't imagine any civilian use.
Joel, one more over there.
Pardon?
There's
Yeah.
one more over there.
A lot of people know where we are at any time.
Yeah, there's a deeply embedded assumption that it's OK for others to know where you are, which makes some of us uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, we live within a network of technology that supports it.
Yeah. The cell phone is part of this Internet of Things that it's embedded in. We could go on, but here's my point. Every single one of those assumptions, while I'm getting help, I'll continue the story. Every single one of those assumptions, I would argue, is negotiable or could have been negotiable. The key issue is that in the design and development of the technology, there was very little agency for you or people that might represent you to be in that conversation. And in fact, because it was 50 years after Gordon Moore's early projections, an awful lot of,
We have a remote, so you can push it back.
yeah, an awful lot of norms about who has a say about technology, which basically, thank you very much. A round of applause. An awful lot of assumptions about who even has the agency to have input in the technology were made such that it was basically up to the technologists to come up with the idea, to put it on the market and build it and see if people would come. And so there were some deeply embedded market assumptions tied to the technology as well. We are now in the early stages of this third digital revolution, and the subtext of everything that I'm going to share is that it's still early enough that the way in which we have input to shape the technology is negotiable. So Captain Picard didn't have the agency to rewrite the code for his universal replicator. It was just a black box to him, and it was a crisis when it failed. We're going to ask the question, if in the journey to the universal replicator, might it be a journey to a replicator that also includes governance, agency, input, and other kinds of things that he didn't have? So here's Neil's roadmap. I'm going to basically cover 4 major points. Early on at the current stage of the roadmap, the negotiation story is around launching a Fab Lab. And so we're going to unpack who are the stakeholders, what are the interests, what's involved in negotiating the creation of a community center for digital fabrication. We'll spend about 5 minutes on that. At the stage that we're sort of at the knee of the curve, where things start to go big exponential multiples, there's a lot of work that happens around the setting of standards. So I want to talk about the negotiations over standards in that stage, and we'll spend about 5 minutes on that. And even though it's 20 years or so out, it's now that the ecosystems are forming, or the basic elements of them. And there is, I would argue, a number of negotiated dimensions over the structure and operation of an ecosystem. And so we're going to talk about that. And even though when Neil talks about the biological models that are 30, 40, or 50 years out, they exist today, of course, in his lab. You can go through the lab, and he will, it's kind of scary to say, here's where we're making life. But I would argue that now is the time to be even thinking about the negotiations of the institutions that need to co-evolve with technology that happens on the scale and the scope that he's describing. And so we'll spend a few minutes on that before we open it up for discussion. So here's again Neil's Fab Lab. I helped, when I was a dean at the University of Illinois, to launch a Fab Lab there. And when, at one level, it seems easy. You install equipment, you have a room, and there you go, right? Well, if you unpack it as a negotiation story, it took 2 or 3 years, not so much to set up the equipment and get it running. That was a matter of weeks. But it took more than a year to agree on where it was going to be located, to persuade people to put in the right wiring and ventilation systems, to then figure out how are we going to get volunteers, is there going to be paid staff, is there a regular annual recurring budget. There were a number of issues, and the way I would describe the negotiations over the creation and launch of a $100,000 Fab Lab is that it's a sequential set of conversations that move from chaos towards more stability. So it's a negotiation that generally ends well. It ends with a community center where people come and design and make things, and that has an impact on society that is beneficial. And so in trying to understand this early stage, we actually did a survey of close to 200 fab leaders around the world, what I call a stakeholder map. Most of them had an affiliation with the Fab Lab, but also had an affiliation with a makerspace or a hackerspace or other stakeholder roles. And we asked them, for example, what's the most practical thing that you've seen done in a Fab Lab? and these are just some of the examples, you have a sense of this from Neil, that there's all sorts of very practical and some pretty wild things that people today are seeing made in these facilities. Coming from a negotiations place, the way I think about something like this is as a matrix with stakeholders on one side and interest on the other. So you see, here's this matrix in which we have every stakeholder, if you will, has a vector of interest or things that they care about. Every interest has a vector of stakeholders that could be positive, negative, or neutral. That's what the heat map says. We actually take those interests for visual purposes and code each stakeholder as a hexagon and tile them so they're in kind of a spiral with the mean in the middle, and the views that are closer to the mean are in the middle, and then further from the mean or outliers are on the outside. Blanks mean a non-response. Green is for positive, red is for negative. And so if we think of the negotiations over the launch of the Fab Lab, there's at least 4 issues in our stakeholder map that are what I would call pain points, where the Z flower, as we call it, on the left is the one in each pair on how important is it. The one on the right is how easy is it, and the gap between the two is the pain in the system. And so internet access is a 0.86 on a scale from 0 to 1 on importance, but a 0.32 on ease, so that's difficult with a couple of bright spots. Learning about digital fabrication, using the Fab Charter, having access to equipment, to software, to sharing of designs. These are all issues in which there's still a gap between how important it is and how easy it is to do, all of which, in a sense, is negotiable. And by the way, if we had gone back in time to the equivalent point in the 1980s with the first 2 digital revolutions, we would have had probably similar or deeper pain points in terms of access to computation or communication capabilities. Now, there were some bright spots currently. People say there's not that big a gap in terms of the ability to do social networking, the ability to be entrepreneurial. Among the labs that exist, there's not a big deal with financial sustainability, access to mentors, access to the academy, even the very idea of anyone being able to make anything. And so I would argue that there are some things that are low-hanging fruit, easier negotiations, some things that are going to be more difficult. But essentially, at this first stage of the roadmap, the negotiations is pretty clear. We know who the stakeholders are. You can get them in a room. You can have the conversations. And in 2 to 3 years, you resolve it in favor of a successful functioning Fab Lab. Now, if we move to the next stage of the roadmap, we're moving now into the world of standard setting. And there's a cartoon that many of you may have seen, but it is appropriate just to set the stage. This is a cartoon on how standards proliferate. As you can see, it says the situation is there are 14 competing standards, and they say there ought to be a single standard, and the situation is now there are 15 competing standards. And the important thing to say about standards is that when it's early on in an ecosystem, it's easy to establish standards because people don't care. Later on, when there are lots of people who have a stake in the standards, the negotiations becomes more complex. So if I had to do the analysis, I've seen cases where in as few as 2 or 3 years, people have been able to set up an important standard. In the digital communication and computation world, TCP/IP is sort of the classic standard that allows this interactive and connectivity that has these multiplying factors. When you get a standard right, it has those properties of allowing for network effects. But the other thing about this is the standards negotiations has the opposite property of the first negotiations in the sense that early on, there's room for unilateral action and people to sort of move forward. As things go on, it becomes increasingly competitive with different people claiming the territory in one way or another, and it becomes more difficult. So we're at a stage where within the Fab ecosystem, there are software, hardware, some material, and some operating standards, but it's not yet standardized in the sense of something like TCP/IP, Neil works very hard to try to standardize across the ecosystem to allow the 1,000 Fab Labs to share designs and do things. Makerspaces aren't as well standardized, but there's still work to be done. And more importantly, there are deeper standards around safety and security, around openness, extensibility, competing standards and controls by regulators that are quite complicated. Regulators, for example, as Neil will tell you, it's very easy to use a Fab Lab to make a mesh network to create your own internet, but there's, I think, 19 states now that make that illegal. And so from the standard setting, Neil showed you his list of the course in how to make almost anything. And of course, when you don't have standards, this is examples of 3D printing and laser printers going awry. When this one burnt in the media lab, it actually had the fire trucks coming. But the point is, every single one of these elements of the course is a dimension on which the negotiation over standards is happening. It's mostly tacit negotiation of people announcing a standard and others either complying or competing. And my prediction is this aspect of the technology will get more complex, not less, over time, because people will increasingly have a stake in competing standards, and there will be winners and losers. Let's move on to the third stage. Now we're moving into a much more complicated space, which is this whole idea of ecosystems. It's hard not to watch the technology media these days and not hear people talk about ecosystems. If Alan were here, he would talk about some work that he has done to unpack what is an ecosystem. He would argue that there's three elements. The first is there are people, and we'll come back to that in a minute, but generally there are platforms, whether it's Wikipedia or Minecraft or any number of digital platforms in which people interact. And then there are processes or mechanisms for interaction. One of his key insights is that most people pay attention to the brilliant founders that launch a new ecosystem or the millions of distributed users in the ecosystem. And what they don't see is what he calls the empowered or empowering middle. So these are the modders of Minecraft, the editors of Wikipedia, but it's the force multipliers, the people who understand the vision, act on it, and then build additional things that really create these network effects. Within the digital fabrication ecosystem, there are a lot of ecosystem level negotiations that we need to think about. What I would argue is that these are negotiations over the overall systems architecture, over who are users, how do we empower an empowered middle, and other kinds of factors. And just to take one example, the governance in this Fab ecosystem right now relies on what's called the Fab Charter. It's a good document. Neil drafted it almost a decade ago when I think I said you need a charter.
It was actually Ed Baffy.
Okay, good. But there are many issues within a given Fab Lab, let alone in the ecosystem, that aren't covered by the charter in terms of who makes what decisions, how do you ensure health and safety. I'm focusing on kind of workplace issues that we know how to deal with in the workplace, but a Fab Lab is not a workplace, so those issues fall between the cracks in the law. And so when you think of governing the ecosystem, there's the negotiations over all of these issues on a distributed basis, and it gets more complicated. Sadly, earlier in November, in Grenoble, France, one of the most sort of technologically mature cities in Europe, a pair of anarchists firebombed their Fab Lab. And in fact, within the anarchist community, they've been since criticized for picking a soft target when, in fact, the Fab Lab stood for community access to technology rather than the imposition of technology. But nonetheless, it's triggered among a number of us in the ecosystem a discussion about how do you set up safety and security in this emerging community of practice. And it's clearly a three-level problem. There's safety and security at the level of an individual lab. There's regional consortia of labs, to think of them as regional networks, and there's a global challenge in terms of safety and security standards, all of which I would argue is negotiable, and it's a complex adaptive negotiation because people will construct ways to think about this, others will engage in various ways, and sometimes there will be people in a room negotiating, and sometimes it will be more tacit. And sometimes there are people who see it in their interest for this not to even happen, as this would indicate. And the question is, how do you deal with negotiations that includes violent opposition? And of course, here at PON, we encounter that in a lot of different negotiated situations. And I would say that the negotiations over the ecosystem for digital fabrication is one that will have many twists and turns, many complex emergent properties. But the most important thing to say about it is early conditions matter. And so having these conversations now about safety and security is decades ahead of the kind of conversations that we wished we had about weaponized social media and some of the other things in the first two digital revolutions. Finally, how do we negotiate over the institutions that co-evolve with the technology? I've argued in other writing that we normally think of collaborative institutions in terms of organizations that collaborate in order to compete, whether it's a labor management partnership or a merger or a strategic alliance or a joint venture. What we see happening increasingly are new institutional arrangements, whether it's open innovation, R&D consortia, public-private partnerships, or large-scale multi-stakeholder consortia, are multi-stakeholder arrangements in which people are collaborating in order to collaborate. I personally have been involved in helping to facilitate the negotiations of 6 multi-stakeholder consortia in the area of open data in science, and they represent a different kind of institutional arrangement. The first thing is, as institutions, they have to do 2 things. They have to create value and they have to mitigate harm. And then there are certain properties of the technology itself. I'm going to get to them in a minute: modularity, reversibility, locality. And in a sense, the question is, can you construct institutions that correspond to the technology? What do I mean by that? When we did our Fab survey, first we asked them about institutions that they thought could keep up with digital fabrication. And on a scale from 0 to 10, people were most confident about educational institutions, business and community or cultural institutions, less so about economic institutions and government or civic institutions. That's their projection in the next 10 years as to whether they'd be able to keep up. This is a drawing that we did for the book in which these are standard technology curves where the technology rises and then as new technology emerges, starts to level off. And you have the next curve and the next curve. And this is on the scale of 1,000 to a million to a billion to a trillion that Neil uses. And it's just a very rough, not even to scale representation of the accelerating rates of change of the technology. Most of our societal institutions change at linear rates. And yet we're dealing with technology that's moving at these progressively faster accelerating rates. And the final thought that I'll share with you is that deep in the technology are certain properties. Digital technology is modular. You can assemble and disassemble, so it's reversible. It has built into it certain principles, like Legos, that a child without a ruler can make something that's precise so that it has reliability or error correction built into it. And it has locality, that what you can do on a small scale has representation or things that happen on a larger scale. And the question that I'd like to pose is that institutions have largely co-evolved with technology. I suspect that the institutions of the 21st century will have to have properties that are similar. That is, think of institutions as being more modular, as being able to assemble. We know how to do that. Disassemble is not so easy. As early as 1918, Robert Michel coined the term the iron law of oligarchy, which was that when you form new institutions, they then immediately focus on their continued existence rather than whatever they were formed to do. And so there's a resistance to disassembly that we need to wrestle with. But essentially, the agile institutions that we need to match this accelerating pace of change, I would argue, have to have certain principles of error correction, such as checks and balances, and certain principles of modularity, of assembly and disassembly, in order to match the pace of change. So back to Captain Picard, he did not have the agency to shape the technology when it went awry. And in a sense, I'm arguing that early on in negotiating over the launch of a Fab Lab, in the setting of standards, in the generation of ecosystems, and even in the propagation of institutions, these are negotiable. And not only they are, but they must be in order for us to, 50 years from now, look back on this and say the technology has delivered on its beneficial potential, created value, but we've also been able to mitigate harm. When we concluded the survey of the Fab Lab leaders, we picked a couple of quotes from the survey in terms of just a metaphor or a phrase they would use to describe digital fabrication. It was only afterward that we figured out which countries they came from. It turns out they were all over the world, and we put the world map behind it upside down just so that we think the third digital revolution is turning lots of things upside down. But I'd like to then end with these concluding quotes and open it up for any of your comments and questions. You started the talk with Neil's review of the 50 years of technology. You had a brief interlude in which you looked at the assumptions that are embedded in the everyday technology that you hold in your hand. And now we're putting on the table, in a sense, renegotiating or negotiating the assumptions in the third digital revolution. Thank you very much. And we do have some time for questions. I'll have Neil come join me up here.
I have two questions, remarks. So I went at MIT. I was very interested by all what you said about computers. I was at IPS, the Earth, Atmosphere and Planetary Science department, and actually I learned there with Kerry Emanuel that the first computer was actually, the design of the computer was made by Arrhenius, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry back in the 19th century. And it was like an assembly of people like that. Each person would solve part of the equations of the Navier-Stokes equations, and they would, each person would solve a little bit. So it was about splitting a big complex problem into small parts. So
computers were people up to around up through the 40s. There were still computers as people, programmed as a group of people. In fact, something very interesting Al Gore said was he views the Constitution as a programming manual for a distributed computer, which is the political body.
So we're just coming full circle.
But, I mean, the way I would connect that, what Joel did almost but didn't quite say that I like when he says it is, if machines can make machines, you need organizations and institutions that make organizations and institutions. This whole institution assumes you can identify the entity, but this is sort of all about fan out. And so how do you make institutions that create institutions?
But that is exactly, it's not just like Neil says, Legos isn't just an analog to what he's describing. It is a model of what he's describing. Without being technologically determinist, I would say that just like machines that make machines, we do need to think of institutions that are constantly reinventing themselves as institutions making institutions, because the problems with accelerating rates of change are never today's problems. And so you need new mechanisms, including some things that are sort of truths that we hold to be self-evident that persist, but you need this constant reinvention capability to keep up with the pace of change.
In fact, to make it existential for the law school, for an op-ed we're writing, I added an example of if you want to buy a toaster. So today, if you want to buy a toaster, there needs to be a store where you give money to purchase the toaster from a worker. The toaster came on a truck that went down a road that, say, got the toaster from a train that went down tracks. that picked it up after customs at a port that came on a ship from a factory. And sort of this building is employed at each of those transitions. If you can go into a Fab Lab and make a toaster, you might make it for yourself. You could pay somebody in the lab. Somebody could give it to you, a gift. It could be barter. But if the whole thing's happening in the Fab Lab, you don't need each of those steps. And so a lot of the skills in this building go away.
So this seems very disruptive to business, but if you can make the toaster and it doesn't have to be made at another location brought to you. But I have a question for you, Neil, and that is, so in your labs and the labs around the world that have been created, have you seen any examples yet of people doing bad things, of weaponizing this fabrication technology?
Yeah. So that
What keeps you up at night?
Not that. That's a standard question. And the reason it doesn't keep me up is we've run these. We had a lab for a while. We were running in Jalalabad in Afghanistan in the middle of a shooting war, a lab in Soshin Gargovi, an apartheid-era township in South Africa. We have labs at what are called the peace walls at Belfast and Derry in Northern Ireland, places of the most just explicit conflict. And interestingly, we don't have an issue with the labs doing bad stuff, not as a belief, just as a statistical statement. And the reason is, in each of those places, doing bad things is already a well-met market need. That they already have lots of people doing bad stuff, and there's no problem getting guns. And in fact, the lab is the worst way to get guns. And so, like during the Morsi riots, a colleague called Fab Lab on the Giza Plateau and said, "Are you okay?" And she sort of laughed and said, "Yeah, the bright inventive kids that had no interest in sectarian conflict are using it as a day off to go work in the lab, and it's really productive."
Now,
And so,
this is
so
the
again,
point. Now,
but
this is the point.
let me transition. So to go to Joel, today we haven't had a problem because doing bad stuff is already everywhere, and this is providing an alternative to doing bad stuff. That's a statement going from 1 to 1,000 Fab Labs. But what Joel's about to say, on a hand after Joel, is as it keeps scaling, it goes beyond it, and you need to figure out how to monitor it. But by way of handing off to Joel, I've had versions of this conversation with rooms of intelligence analysts and army generals, and half of them gasp and say we have to control it. The other half of the room gasped at the first half of the room to say, this is the best thing we could be doing, and by the way, you don't control it anyway. And so you can't control it. You can provide incentives to do it in open, to share, and do it in communities. Joel?
So we did about 40-some interviews of Fab leaders in writing the book. And I wrote and give props to Neil, because he literally gave us the equivalent of his Rolodex and said, call anybody you want. And we did ask almost everybody about this. And on the one hand, for example, the second Fab Lab in the world, which is in rural India, he said kids regularly come in and the first thing they want to do is make a knife. And he pulls them aside and says, we don't make weapons in a Fab Lab. And so there are some norms emerging that are beneficial. And Fab Labs do involve collaborative design so that the ones on the Peace Wall in Ireland are bringing Protestants and Catholics together in remarkable ways. And the people who did that are now building labs in South America with the FARC to help with their reintegration into civil society. So there's a lot to be said about how Fab Labs mitigate harm rather than create problems. But here's where Alan and I lean in and say, not so fast, Neil. First of all, as the ability to make things accelerates, right now making a gun is a 3D printable project, but it doesn't at all compare to just going out and buying one. But if the ability continues, that will become less so. More importantly, there is a choke point in Fab Labs around the materials you use, which are generally plastics or powdered metals or other kinds of things, so that there is a potential environmental issue around all the raw materials that you need. It's less than you need in a global supply chain, but there are still issues there. I think the biggest, though, safety and security issue of bad people doing bad things comes with biofab. That the ability of medical ethics review panels to keep up with the technology that you can do with biofab is just pitiful. I mean, as an institution, those panels are not at all set up to handle the 1,000-some Fab Labs we have now, let alone the tens of thousands that we'll soon be having. And so I see that as a very fearful future in which that probably does keep you up at night.
So, question in the
Good.
back.
More questions? I see hands back here. Yeah.
Two questions in particular. One has to do with the IP, which is like, how do I control, like if I make a Fab Lab here, I won't be, for example, infringing the industrial design rights that Apple could have for the design of the iPhone, things like that. How is that controlled? And the second one is specifically about the taxes. If I going back to the toaster and get the toaster, how does it, how do I pay for the taxes of that toaster? Like VAT, or I pay for a service, or like a product itself?
So those are both good
yeah.
questions. I'll
So
let Neil start.
IP is surprisingly easy to answer. In my lab at MIT, when we develop robots with Airbus to make jumbo jets, we create conventional IP. But for IP to have any utility, there needs to be a barrier to infringement. You need to identify infringement. It needs to be enforceable. And there's few enough airframers that applies. In Fab Labs, anything you do in a Fab Lab can be done in any other Fab Lab, and so it's not protectable as conventional IP. But that's not new. It's exactly what we live through here. Music was the labels, or you played the piano. Then came file sharing, and nobody paid anybody. Music revenues plummeted. They've come back up with the recognition that Amazon took DRM off of music, but made money by making it easy to buy and sell music. And Spotify turned it into a service, and bands make more money from concerts. And so rather than controlling the music as a scarce resource, it was ways to get value from it. In the same way, software was Microsoft or IBM, or almost nobody wrote it for themselves. Open source came, nobody pays anybody. And then what's emerged, like copy protection has all but failed in software. Open source is now underlying maybe most software business models in some way, directly or indirectly. But the value comes from how you add value to the software. And so the common mistake we run into Fab Labs is equating IP with money and with fame and with value. And so it's open source hardware, just like we've been through with software and music. And so we help people in Fab Labs understand how to get value from what they develop. But if they try to protect it as traditional IP, they're doomed because there's no barrier to infringement and you can't identify infringement. And so you have to tease apart getting value from invention from the traditional notion of IP, which just doesn't fit.
So just to build on that, deeply embedded in the concept of IP is the assumption of a market. And what we find is that within the ecosystem, an industrial designer in Norway will post a design for an office chair, and 50 other people around the world will modify the design to match their needs. And in this ecosystem of sharing, the norms are not to protect the IP, but to encourage the sharing and reuse. And then the question is, well, how do you make a living in this way? Blair Evans in Detroit has taken about a 20-acre part of sort of the burnt-out food deserts within the city of Detroit and built a large central lab and a set of satellite labs where people can make their own hydroponics and mini housing and other kinds of things to address local needs. And he argues that 1/3 of your time you should be earning a salary to buy things that you need to buy, services or what have you. 1/3 of your time you should be going to your local Fab Lab to make what you need, and 1/3 of your time you should be doing things that are creative or what have you. But it's a different vision of a post-salary kind of economy. Alan and I have a hypothesis, which we're just beginning to flesh out, which is that the most remote rural areas of society, he's done a lot of work in rural Alaska, may be the places where digital fabrication will move most quickly because there aren't folks enforcing IP or imposing other barriers to use, the global supply chains don't reach these remote areas well, so spare parts and things like that are hard to get, whereas a Fab Lab, you can make them when you need them. And there are actually ancient traditions of barter and exchange, which may take on new meaning with blockchain and other mechanisms. And so it's very possible that and this is going to sound Marxist, when you give people the ownership of the means of production, everything changes. And that, in a sense, we're pointing to a situation that's likely to be a blend. There will be still salaried work. There will be things that you purchase. But increasingly, this technology points to different economic models that may involve very different norms for ownership of intellectual property.
So to pick up on that, and with tax, what's amusing about tax is when we do transactions in this Fab network that cross national boundaries, we have to deal with tax authorities. But an awful lot of what's happening in Fab Labs is invisible to tax. It's activity, but it's not taxed because it's not traditional economic activity. And so, if you look at the great battles of this era, of like Trump versus Hillary and Leave versus Remain, a big part of them was like, do we join with the world or do we set up barriers to the world? But it assumes they're in opposition. And so baked in is this idea that a company creates a job that creates work, that creates money, that leads to things. If you can directly produce things, it's not utopia, it's not free. But all of those assumptions bake into what is money and what is work change. And so there's this, much of the activity I'm describing is just out of the tax economy.
So most civic leaders
let other people ask.
Don't yet have this on their radar screen, but there are major tax implications as this multiplies, but there's also civic leaders in this Barcelona case and now others that are buying into the notion of civic local self-sustainability, even as they stay globally connected.
So Bill Foster just introduced a bill. He's a remaining scientist in Congress. He introduced a bill in the US House for universal access to digital fabrication, not appropriated as something to buy, but chartered as being in the national interest as a public-private partnership. So other questions?
So I'm curious of what the sort of long-term picture is looking forward, in the sense that as you talk about the things going on in Detroit or in Alaska and so forth, I mean, it reminds me of the, I guess I forget if it's the first or the second revolutions that you were talking about earlier, where there's a lot of creativity, a lot of sort of hobbyists experimenting, innovating, and then we get to a point where we're all using Microsoft products and Google and Amazon and so forth. That there is this bottleneck, and I guess the multiplication of communication and so forth ends up not playing out necessarily in the ways that it might have. And I don't know whether this gets to the point that you were making about having more involvement of a broader base of stakeholders and kind of setting the terms by which the technology develops. But I guess my background is, first of all, as a physics student at MIT, and then a PhD in history of science person at Berkeley, and now teaching negotiation. So all these components I find very personally.
Welcome.
But I guess I'm just reminded of all the discussions in the 1960s, say, around computation and all the discussions of sort of the end of work, the creation of like an affluent society, and the end of scarcity and so forth.
So let me start with it. And we interviewed a chief strategist at Intel, and we said, okay, you've been living with Moore's Law even before it had a name. How would you describe life in a big corporation, which is, of course, one of the winners in the story that you just told? And he said, the scene in the Indiana Jones movie where the boulder's coming along and Indiana Jones is racing to stay ahead of the boulder? He said, that's been the last 30 years at Intel. That Moore's Law isn't a law of nature. It's a social construction. It's a business strategy, and it's an industry strategy, and we've been racing to stay ahead. So immediately it posed two questions. One, is there an Intel for digital fabrication, the racing to stay ahead of the boulder? And we don't see that on the horizon. Neil's describing a much more distributed capability, particularly if the machines make the machines. But it's not at all clear how you stay ahead of that exponential change on a distributed basis. So that's personally a potential blind side in the ecosystem or a need. The deeper question that you pose is, will there be a couple of winner-take-all dominators of this ecosystem in the next 10 or 20 years? And we certainly have an economic system that rewards that kind of dominance in various ways. And so that's a risk. It is possible that there's properties of this technology, such as I was mentioning in the remote areas, where it will race ahead and, in a sense, get so established that it will be harder for that to happen. I personally see it as a horse race in which it could go in the same way as the first two digital revolutions, with a couple of dominant players and then an ecosystem of wannabes that eventually emerge in one way or another. Or it could have this different property, which includes some barter and exchange, that includes other mechanisms for exchange than just a strict winner-take-all market model. But, you know.
So yeah, view this not as this revolution, then that one, then that one. It's all one, but this finishes it by taking it from virtual to physical. So with that observation, the current era where we all shop on Amazon and use Android or iOS is really sort of a historical anomaly. It's the last few decades that we've all been turned into consumers in that sense. This isn't simply a revert to city-states and agrarian economy, because it's all based on global connectivity for data and knowledge, but like think globally but fabricate locally. And so you're all using iOS or Android likely, but if you walk down Mass Ave and you think about food, there's a few chains, but generally most of you, the restaurants you go to aren't the chains. And there's a few mass food markets, but generally most of you like shopping in interesting food markets with interesting ingredients. And because food is so local and sort of tangible, it doesn't disappear into the cloud and we all eat the same food. And so if you think about going down Mass Ave and the local markets, plus there's the Starbucks and the local cheese shop, but then there's the big supermarket, the rest of technology could end up looking like that. It's not you do it all yourself, or it's all not mass manufacturing, but it fills all these interesting places in between.
And there may be hybrids. Neil's already been doing work with IKEA, which sees the handwriting on the wall and says maybe they should be making modular components that people can use in their assembly of things that they design and make, not just finished products. And so they have a business strategy that assumes digital fabrication will continue to grow, and how can they be part of it? So that might be a more symbiotic kind of story. Yeah.
You're wrong.
About which?
About the food shopping. You take a poll in this room. Ask how many people buy their food at Whole Foods. I'll bet you 3/4 of the people raise their hand.
But let's see. But
And
what
who
about
also buys
restaurants? How
something
many?
that's
How many?
Star
You're right about restaurants. You're wrong about the food.
Okay, I'll take 50%.
I'll take the other 50.
No, but in writing the book, that was roughly the division of labor. So if I got the restaurants right, I'm fine, and Joel can point out that I was wrong about Whole Foods. But to overstretch the example, if you view Whole Foods as the feedstock, the research, what I'm doing is try to reduce that to 20 parts where there's no value added. If the restaurant is sort of where you're adding value with the locality, I'm fine if I only got the restaurant part right.
But just to take your example and even push it even further, there are some things that mass production does that are hard to match with the productive capability of a Fab Lab now. In 10 years, there's an increasing array of things with powdered metal and what have you that you can do locally that will be the same or better than mass production. But I would argue that there will still be certain kinds of things that involve safety in the production and what have you that will still involve a market economy and productive capability. I mean, right now, if you go into either of our houses, you'll find very few things made in the Fab Lab. And so what we see is the handwriting on the wall. I would say that Fab Labs today, the killer app is not making what you need, but the experience of designing and making things. And parents are insistent that their kids have digital literacy by going in and doing project-based learning, and that's very powerful. Corporations are providing the opportunities for their employees to do collaborative design, and that's very powerful. But embedded in it is this doubling story, and that's what we're seeing on the horizon, in a sense saying to lean in now.
That's what I wanted to pick up on. Google failed to sell search and then discovered you don't sell search, you sell the benefits of search. In the same sense, if Fab Labs just try to sell a widget in the lab, generally that's a disaster. The Fab Lab business models sell the benefits of making. So in Northern Ireland, it's crossing the peace wall. In Barcelona, let's see, we worked with Kagame's administration to set up Fab Labs in Rwanda, where they had a terrible import inequality, and it's changing the economy from money flowing out of the country to local sustainability. In a lab we did in Alaska with Alaska natives, it's great cultural traditions and terrible alcoholism, unemployment, and suicide, and it's bridging between modern technology and traditional culture. And each of those are monetizable and measurable. And so many of the most significant benefit models aren't the widget, but the benefits of doing the making.
Yes?
Thinking about the reports in this morning's paper about the changes in the Chinese government, and
Yeah.
thinking back to Brave New World, how do you see small elites changing the mix of the game and controlling the negotiation, perhaps controlling this process, or there being a competition among different cultures and civilizations that have different models for control?
Boy, that's a really good question. Because from a negotiations point of view, the winning strategy isn't winning, it's shaping the rules of the game. And many of the negotiations that are in effect surrounding this technology have rules of the game that haven't been codified, aren't fully expressed. What I would say is that it's remarkable the degree to which the labs are emerging in all sorts of places independent of country elites. That the threshold of $100,000 to launch a Fab Lab is not that high for most communities. And the ability increasingly to make the Fab Lab from a Fab Lab is a multiplier. And so I think now is the time to be having conversations among the folks in the ecosystem about issues of governance, of safety, of security, and in the process, constructing the rules of the game through the way in which we have those conversations. And so I think what will be critical is that it not be a conversation by a few, and that we develop forms of what I call lateral alignment, ways to build alignment horizontally across disparate groups of people in an ecosystem that are different than a centralized control model.
So to pick up on that,
that's back to the institutions that make institutions.
This surprisingly flies under the radar. I've worked with Chinese leadership on doing this in China, and they love this because they see the end of China mass manufacturing, and they want to empower people locally in China. And so, I've worked with Russia's leadership, although not recently. And so people who might scare you as scary governments actually think this is a good thing. In the U.S., the most right-wing red state Republicans love this because it's it exactly fits them. But at places like Davos with heads of state, they're kind of in the kiddie pool of just trying to understand this. The leaders where this is happening aren't them. So like a great microcosm is lots of coverage in Barcelona of Catalan separatism versus nationalism. Meanwhile, the last city administration, the current city administration, has gone all in on this. So rather than, they have over 50% youth unemployment. The economy is broken. And so rather than buying products that come in the harbor and sending out trash, they want a sustainable city. And so they've gone from one Fab Lab to setting up one per district to now they're taking a whole district of the city and using it as a laboratory for a circular economy. And that's lasted through multiple city administrations and has nothing to do with nationalism versus Catalan separatism.
This is the
so a
point
lot
which
of
I say it does have something to do with.
No, but I would push back on that because I've spent a lot of time with the leaders in multiple administrations, and from their perspective, what they tell me is whether it's Catalan nationalism or Spanish nationalism, it doesn't help their problems. they're getting on with the business over here, and it's not where people are looking. And so the leaders leading this aren't the leaders that everybody thinks are the leaders. It's happening somewhere else. And that is a pattern we see repeating over and over.
We're almost at time, but
I was going to just ask, what part of today's session is included in your book, and what parts are beyond the book?
this is the unpaid promotional announcement. They do have books outside, and we will sign them. The 4 levels of negotiation are hinted at in the book, but that's really some new framing that I did specifically for this talk. The technology and the underlying social challenges of literacy, access, mitigating harm, and cultivating ecosystems are all discussed at quite a bit of length in the book. And we also talk about the deep underlying history of the 3 digital revolutions, and frankly, the lack of history on the social sciences. If you go back to the very beginning of John Stuart Mill, he developed his ideas coexisting with the birth of the first industrial revolution. And the notions of an invisible hand in a marketplace got joined in ways that make the two almost inseparable. You could look at 200 years of social science at trying to figure out what to do about the externalities and downsides of markets, and finding ways to mitigate harm, but not necessarily to change the underlying logic of the system. We have the opportunity now to, and this is really the final 2 chapters of the book, to think about this in a deep, fundamental way and to ask those kinds of questions still early while things are malleable.
So let me make it very concrete for what's not in the book. The roadmap I described is, a week or so ago, I had a meeting at Madison Park Vocational School with the mayor's office, the school chancellor in his office, the Boston Foundation, and the leadership of Madison Park that's been kind of floundering about Boston, Somerville, and Cambridge all joined Barcelona in this Fab City commitment, 40-year countdown to producing what they consume. And it's not a brick wall, it's a few % a year. The meeting we just had was about a really interesting project we're starting, which is ramping up Madison Park to learn how to make machines to then teach Boston Public Schools to make its own maker spaces, and then use those in their communities to start producing what the communities currently consume. And so that's a really exciting project just after the book that's starting. And so now that leads to you. This doubling is you, that if this all sounds good, don't just read the book. The local cities are actually part of this project, and the local labs are doubling. And so this can be, you don't need to be a spectator, you can be a protagonist.
So I have a final thought that I'll share to wrap it up. The book begins, of course, with Moore's Law and this doubling story with the first 2 digital revolutions. Sherry Lassiter, who now heads up the Fab Foundation and is located in Neil's Center for Bits and Atoms, had noticed that the pile of requests on her desk to launch new Fab Labs kept getting twice as big every year. It was literally doubling. And so in the book, we have called the doubling of digital fabrication Lass's Law, as the correspondence to Moore's Law. So the final thought that I'll leave with you, and our father was one who loved puns, so he would enjoy this. We concluded that just as we have Moore's Law and Lass's Law, at the end of the book we do point out that, in our view, Lass is more. So with that, we'd like to thank you very much.